We're back. How are you doing? It's very windy here today, and I'm walking along the coast pretty much as fast as I can walk because it's so cold. It's kind of cold that really cuts through the layers straight to the bone. Today, we have a conversation with Lorraine Close, who is the outreach director at Edinburgh Community Yoga, but she's also a nurse practitioner, and she's been working in prisons and psychiatric hospitals and addiction recovery services and community centres across Scotland for a really long time. We wanted to get her on because we have a lot of good conversations with Lorraine. She's actually lives down the road from us, which is remarkable because we don't live down the road from that many people. And there's a lot in here where she talks about the trauma-informed work that they do, which I think you'll find really interesting, but also just the challenges of running community-based projects and the funding challenges. I guess it's a little, I was going to say depressing. It's a little depressing, but there's a little bit of a depressing conversation because it kind of maps out the landscape that so many of you are working in at the moment and how frustrating that is. But there is a bit of a silver lining, perhaps. Silver, I don't know if that's right. But the positives, I guess, that Lorraine talks about is what can we do in our immediate communities? And that obviously taps into the work of Cormac Russell and asset-based community development. Yeah, there's a lot in here. It's a really beautiful conversation and frustrating in parts. Enjoy. We'll be back at the end.
How to stand on shifting sand. How to bend but stay intact.
Okay, I'm here today with Lorraine Close. Lorraine is someone I know in real life, and we end up having lots of good conversations. And one of the last times I was talking to her, I was saying I really need to get you on the podcast. Before that, Lorraine came and did a webinar for us on trauma-informed practice in the yoga community, but then also with other applications. And I just thought it was so interesting. I thought I need to get Lorraine on, have a chat with her, talk to her about some of her areas of specialty, but then also hopefully have some time for a chat at the end because we usually have a good time ranting about stuff. Lorraine, thanks so much for coming on. Really appreciate it. Who are you? How'd you get here?
We practically did a podcast in the preparation phone call, didn't we?
I know. We've got like
So
30 minutes in, yeah.
so my name's Lorraine, like Andrew said. I'm the outreach director of a not-for-profit social enterprise based in Edinburgh in Scotland called Edinburgh Community Yoga. And I also have a background in nursing and lecture at the University of Edinburgh in nursing studies. So I guess I've been hanging out with Andrew a bit recently, having gone along to their Wild Strong classes, and we've had lots of really interesting conversations about some of the work that we do at Edinburgh Community Yoga, but also just really the wider conversations around trauma-informed practice, movement practices, and yoga. And through a sort of meandering way, we've ended up here.
Yeah. And one of the things that I really want to kind of figure out is how did you get into yoga? Like, when did you start practicing? And is there a sort of like specific origin story or I don't know, epiphany that you had in your life?
Yeah, I mean, probably a bit of a messy story, to be honest, but I grew up in Glasgow and spent most of my teenage years and into my 20s really learning very well how to socialize through alcohol. That was really normal in those days. We were 12 when we started drinking, and
Wow.
that continued. And I guess I spent quite a lot of time traveling through my 20s and was sort of introduced to the concept of yoga. I spent a bit of time living in San Francisco, and definitely was engaged in a yoga environment that felt sort of too cool for me. So had the experience of turning up to yoga studios and feeling intimidated, but I definitely saw that there was value in the practice. I then spent quite a long time living in Thailand, began practicing yoga more regularly, and I guess through that practice started to learn how to sit with myself. And sometimes that was uncomfortable, but I think that really was the beginning of a transformation for me in the way that I related to socializing, to the idea. I was a really good partier, and I'd built my entire social identity around being fun at a party and
Yeah.
usually being, heavily under the influence. And I guess that practice of yoga started to teach me to be able to sit with myself. And what came up was a little bit of discomfort and a little bit of awkwardness. And probably not at all being the funnest person at the party, but the person who wants to have a, serious conversation about philosophical concepts, with a little bit of dancing thrown in. And it was really the practice of yoga that taught me to sit with that and to be accepting of that, and transformed the way that my personal relationship with myself and with other people, I guess. I then spent a couple of years, well, I'd been in India for a long time, and I went back and did some work at a clinic in a city called Bhopal, where in the 1980s there was an environmental
Yeah. Huge
disaster.
disaster.
Yeah, with a pesticide leak, and more than that, with environmental contamination that happened over quite a long period of time. There's probably a whole podcast talking about that. But part of the work that I did at that clinic, or the clinic was called Sambhavna, and it really focused on integrative care models. And so they had a yoga therapist there who was really bringing yoga back to its essence in a way that wasn't wrapped up in inverted commas coolness, or the sort of hipster mentality that I'd seen in San Francisco. And I saw these really, really simple practices that would happen with a Muslim man on one side of a curtain and a Hindu woman on the other side, and a yoga therapist taking people through, really simple, straightforward practices that were focused on health benefit. And I guess at that point, I thought that my career would be focused in international development and sort of global health work. But I'd spent a little bit of time working in a prison in Kilmarnock in Glasgow, prior to traveling, or in between traveling. And during that time, I spent far too much time giving out methadone and diazepam to traumatized, mostly young men, who didn't have, often didn't have teeth in their mouth and couldn't read and write. And so I guess I started to think about my experiences, my own experience of yoga, what I'd witnessed in terms of yoga in Bhopal, and really started to think about how that could weave into the really disastrous health inequality that I saw in Scotland, which some of you might know is a country where we have the worst life expectancy in the whole of Western Europe, and where the gap between the richest and the poorest sort of geographical areas, the gap in not only life expectancy but in the number of years lived in good health is really significant. So from there, I started sort of hatching ideas around what a yoga not-for-profit would look like. I was sort of crushing on international organizations that did similar work. And then in 2013 maybe, I met Laura Wilson, who is my co-director at Edinburgh Community Yoga and also my best friend in the whole world. We met on a train on the way back up from a training in Sheffield. And having both been at the same training, we got the train back to Edinburgh together. And from that moment on, just forged a way forwards. Laura was already working quite hard to set up community yoga programs in Edinburgh. I had this idea to set up a not-for-profit, and so the work, we just merged together and have been there running Edinburgh Community Yoga ever since.
It was going to be one of the first questions I wanted to ask you was about Edinburgh Community Yoga. So I'd just like to get an idea of the organization and maybe the the mission that that you see in Edinburgh Community Yoga. I think that would be a good place to start. What your remit is, who you work with, some of the programs you've done through it.
Yeah, so we're constituted as a not-for-profit social enterprise. The business model being that we generate income streams from public classes, training for yoga teachers, corporate work, and work in partnership with prisons and the NHS. And then that supports our outreach work in the community, really with a mission and vision of making yoga as accessible as possible in areas where you don't find traditional yoga studios. So essentially, the root of our work is really embedded in a desire to reduce health inequality in our country and to move from a place of sort of disease management to a place of salutogenesis where we can actually support and advocate for health in all areas. We really recognize, and I'm sure we'll come on to this later, but we recognize the multiple barriers that exist that mean that so many people in this country will never set foot and never would want to set foot in a yoga studio. And so really the mission and the vision of the organization was to take people, to meet people where they are, to take the practice of yoga out into communities, into prisons, into psychiatric hospitals, but also into local communities around Edinburgh, Fife and the Lothians, working in a way that really made the access point achievable and accessible for people. And I guess our vision is that everybody has the opportunity to access some of the benefits of the practice of yoga, instead of it feeling like it is an activity that is sort of only available to middle-class, flexible women.
Yeah. There's a couple things there that I kind of want to unpack because you had some statements, each of which I think are worth following up on. First off, you used one of my favorite words, which is salutogenesis. And I think that's probably worth talking about just really, really briefly. So in your own words, how would you define salutogenesis, or like, philosophically, what does that mean versus kind of working off a disease model?
I think really it's trying to work in a way that has an approach to health that really focuses on factors that promote well-being instead of trying to focus on the cause of disease. There's a very good TED talk. It was Aaron Antonovsky who sort of coined that
Yes.
term
Yep. Yep.
around salutogenesis. Where I first sort of made contact with it was in a TED talk by Harry Burns, who Professor Harry Burns was our chief medical officer. And some years ago now, it's actually quite old, he did a brilliant TED talk on health in the East End of Glasgow and his work as a surgeon, and talked about really the ideas of the concepts of purpose and meaning as a means to healthful societies. And ultimately, that's what we see through yoga. It's what we wish to create through the practice of yoga in community settings.
Yeah, I think it's such a powerful idea to look at the sort of social determinants of health, but in a positive way. Like, what are these assets that can promote wellness and thriving and actually, like, meaningful existence, as opposed to just looking at deficits. And it's really big. It also really, I think, helps with that trap. A lot of times the wellness industry falls into, of putting the onus on the individual and making it a matter of willpower than actually looking at, the environmental factors that can help contribute to sort of a complete health, by meaningful metrics. So that's one of the things I just wanted to get out of the way. But what I really wanted to talk about, because you've mentioned it a few times, and I think we should go ahead and talk about this for a few minutes. In your own experience, you were talking about, someone who grew up in Glasgow ending up in San Francisco and kind of maybe butting heads or coming up to this barrier in terms of culture, coolness, maybe class dynamics. And then you talked about it again through this idea of accessibility. And really, there's a couple different layers that we can think about when we talk about yoga, barriers to practicing yoga. And some of those could be social, they could be perceptions of who yoga is for. And I'd like for you to kind of talk about that. Both start off maybe with your personal experience, how you felt, and then maybe how you applied that at a more systemic level with your later work.
Yeah, I mean, so I have, and I'm sure that most people who have engaged in yoga have felt that sense of sometimes walking into a yoga studio feeling a little bit intimidating. And I say that with full knowledge that I fit the demographic of people who we typically associate with engaging in the practice of yoga. Um, and I think there's multiple factors, whether that comes from our own internal insecurities and worries, or whether it comes from a real sense of sort of cultures of cliquiness or othering that happen within the yoga world. Most people that I know can talk to that sense of feeling a little bit uncertain and a little bit unsure. Actually, when you go into any new group, but particularly there is something about the capitalized version of yoga around the clothing, the studio setup, the untalked about etiquette of the ways that we behave and respond. And I was actually talking about this at a training I was running on a yoga teacher training in Glasgow a couple of weekends ago. The fact, and I don't have the answer to this, but I'm so conscious, I would happily drink a can of Coke after a long working day in Edinburgh, when I've stopped at the garage, I berate myself for it, but I definitely do it. Um, I would never, ever, ever walk into a yoga studio drinking a can of Coke. And I've always been really curious about why that is. I'm a confident person, but there is some sort of inbuilt trait within me, and I think within most people, if they were honest, that means that, we want to fall into the cultural norms and expectations of ways that we behave when we inhabit what is sometimes talked about as a high demand group. And I think the culture of yoga is that. So I guess having experienced that myself, and that's as somebody who was flexible, young, female, able-bodied, with the financial ability to pay for yoga classes, what is very, very clear to me that when you come from a marginalized group, when you have experienced systemic injustice that most of the people that we work with do, whether that's around race, gender, poverty, the barriers, that feeling is multiplied by a significant percentage. And I guess what becomes really clear is that feeling that you belong in spaces like the yoga space is really hard. And in fact, there's part of me that thinks, my goal in what we do is not to try to herd everybody into a yoga studio that would never feel like they fit in there. It's to try and create an environment where we can all recognize that the practice of yoga is actually within all of us. It's skills that we can learn, it's skills that we can be taught, and we can be taught them in any type of community environment by somebody who facilitates that in a meaningful way. And then we can learn them for ourselves, and we can take them out into the world. So I can talk a little bit more about the specific barriers. I think finance is obviously the one that's talked about the most, but it isn't enough to make classes affordable. And we see this time and time again. I've got so many examples from my work at Edinburgh Community Yoga where local yoga studios would really kindly want to partner with us and would offer free yoga passes for our outreach students. So our model is that we run trauma-informed yoga programming out in community areas. And then, for example, a yoga studio would say, hey, we want to give free passes to your outreach students. And the reality is that the only time that they were ever used was when I organised a group of women from one of our groups for women in recovery to go along with me. And there was quite a lot of facilitation required around getting into that space and then people feeling comfortable in that space. So it's complex, right? And it isn't just about money. So it isn't enough to stick signs on our yoga studio doors or websites that say yoga for all or yoga for everyone. We have to really explicitly work hard to move the threshold, move the bar of the point of accessibility.
I remember you don't need to relate the whole story, but I remember you've also said you had some experiences with some of your outreach students, actually trying to go and take advantage of those free classes and actually really feeling ostracized and alienated, not even a way that was just their own personal perception, but actually having people be quite rude to them because they didn't look the correct way. It didn't look like they were supposed to be there.
Absolutely. And we have, more than one sort of story of that happening, that, we all create expectations culturally around the types of people and the ways of being that we sort of expect to meet our colleagues in particular environments. And that sense of judgment, and for most people that we work with, the sense of judgment, the sense of low self-esteem, the sense of not belonging in spaces that are built around wellness, particularly for lots of people who have spent lots of time in sort of institutionalized environments, the NHS, the prison system. They aren't environments that are enriched in any way. Often they're not environments that make people feel enriched or feel like they get to access enriched environments in the way that other people do. And beginning to explore that journey of feeling like it could be possible for you to belong in that environment, in an enriched environment like a yoga studio, is actually quite a complex journey that takes time.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about something now. This hadn't occurred to me before, but I was just thinking about prisons and physical activity, and there's a big gendered component as well. And what I mean is, if you're a male prisoner, you'll have access to weightlifting. At least in American prison systems, when you get out, there's lots of sort of either working class or less class divided, opportunities. So what I mean is you could get into boxing. Anyone could join a football club, in the UK. Anyone could do weightlifting, and it doesn't have to necessarily be like a glitzy gym. You could probably find like a sort of working class powerlifting gym with old rusty weights and things like that. And that would be a space that for men would just feel quite accessible. But then if we look at a lot of the opportunities for physical activity or any kind of personal practice that are sort of seen as women coded, female coded, um, they often have a sort of middle class veneer to them, whether that's fair or not. But I'm thinking like bar, Pilates, yoga, all these things. One would assume that they'd be in quite like an expensive middle class coded studio. So that's an additional barrier that I just never even really thought about.
Yeah, definitely. But it doesn't have to be. And I think that's the question: is that point of accessibility, when we can start to empower people to understand and believe that actually their community deserves well-being practices like yoga as much as any other community. Then we and always our vision and mission has been that the demographic of our teachers at Edinburgh Community Yoga represent the demographic um, of participants that turn up on our programs, and that's beginning to happen. So we have 5 yoga teachers on our teaching team who have come from outreach programs, and who we have supported through subsidized scholarship and mentorship and yoga teacher training to then go out and teach in their own communities. And what we see there is that the investment that those teachers have in the work that they do makes a really significant difference in the feedback that we get from participants, and the way that those teachers who have that experience of knowing what it feels like to feel really unwelcome in a traditional yoga space, the way that they then go out and facilitate in their own communities is it's different, and it's really profound. And if we can work towards that model, then you have community led well-being practices that don't need ultimately organizations like Edinburgh Community Yoga to go in and set up programming. And I think that sort of feeds into some of you and Jill actually have got me into Cormac Russell's connected community work. And in an ideal world, there wouldn't be a need for Edinburgh Community Yoga to do what we do, because communities would be doing it for themselves.
Yeah, there's a lot I want to talk about in that. It's kind of something I want to save towards the end, but I think it's worth bringing up now. I want to make sure we leave enough time to talk about trauma informed practice, but I guess I don't want the entire episode to be about yoga. But as you're talking, I was thinking, is there something unique about the Western adoption of yoga that gives it more perceived baggage than other practices? And that's one of the things I wanted to talk about. But then I would like to talk about the power dynamics, like you mentioned. Is it possible to make these sort of bottoms up community led organizations where we don't need like a top down administrative level to give people opportunities to move? And are there any examples of that happening? That's that's a lot to unpack. I don't know if we fit that all in one podcast.
The first part of your question about yoga, I think, is probably a good place to start. And then
Yeah, let's start
we
there.
can move on to the complexity of the organizational structures, which is pretty at the forefront of my mind at the moment.
Okay.
But I guess first of all, and one of the things I've been thinking about quite a lot is in the work that I do in particular around trauma-informed practice, it could be said that you're distilling the practice of yoga to a point that it moves away from being a practice of yoga and is actually a practice of movement. But I would really challenge that. And I think what we don't want to ever do, is appropriate yoga to the point that it isn't yoga anymore and still call it yoga. But B, we also don't want to withhold some of the really important elements of the practice, and some of the elements of the practice that I have benefited from, and many people that I work with and know have benefited from, which is that yoga isn't just a movement-based exercise practice. If we look at the Yoga Sutra, so the original scripture of yoga, and remembering, and again, we could do a whole podcast on this, but most commonly the roots of yoga are attributed to sort of Vedantic philosophy, linked to Buddhism, long, rich history, which I know a tiny amount of. But when we work in a trauma-informed way, we're not necessarily incorporating all of those really deeply philosophical aspects, but what we are doing is dripping them in when people are interested in them. And trauma-informed yoga is never about withholding those elements of the practice. But what I started to say was when we get into what is yoga, so the Yoga Sutra says, yoga chitta vritti nirodha, the chitta vritti being that constant fluctuation, the stilling of the fluctuation of the mind, right? This spinning of our mind. Yoga is a practice of developing stillness. It is a practice of developing stillness in the mind, present moment experience through movement and breath. Because ultimately, if we are to go and sit in meditation for 12 hours a day, most of us don't have a chance because our physical bodies are not designed for that. So yoga is the stilling of the fluctuation of the mind, yoga chitta vritti nirodha. And so often we've moved away from that. Now, we could talk about enlightenment, we could talk about spiritual ascension. The reality is most of us in the modern world are doing our best to get through the day. We're doing our best to get through the day, through the week, and to make sense of the madness that is the current systems and constructs that we live in the West, but also globally. So, is my goal when I facilitate yoga or in my own practice to become enlightened? Well, it isn't, and people might argue with that. But for me, the goal is to find a way to sit with myself, a way to find stillness, a way to recognize when, you're spinning into the future or the past, and to center and ground in that, I guess, something that is different from the thinking of our mind. And that is the practice of yoga now. The entry point to that is through movement, and through the asana practice. So asana in yoga is the idea of the posture. So when you listen to the way that yoga words are described, they'll always end in the word asana. The asana is the posture. And so for me, that, that's the benefit of some of that, the benefit of that ability to be still, even if it's just for 2 seconds, the benefit of that ability to notice that there is something different to the thinking of our mind is where some of the real benefit of yoga is, that makes it slightly different to an exercise group or a knitting group or, any of the other things that you can do. And we're actually just finishing up some research at the University of Edinburgh just now, doing a realist evaluation of our yoga programs. And the one thing that's coming through even more than I ever expected it to was the benefit of that ability to have little moments of, I'm not going to call them stillness, because often for the groups that we work with, it isn't complete stillness, but it's a little bit more stillness. It's a little bit more quietness. It's a little bit more of a sense of self. And then the flip side of that is probably that yoga, some of the yoga philosophy, but more, it's not even the philosophy, it's the way that yoga culture has been created at its extreme, which is around, I don't want to say pseudo-spiritualism, that feels unkind, but around constructs that aren't questioned and around ways of being that we actually don't know very much about. And often in the yoga community, we profess to. So I don't know, I could use the example of the chakra system. And often, so it is not uncommon to hear a yoga teacher say something like, now, when you do this posture, it will open your heart chakra. And you might have a vision of, a color or a sense of openness. I'm not very good at it because I don't talk in those ways. But actually, when we study the system of chakras, the idea of that sort of 7-point chakra system is a completely modern, I don't even know the words, a modern reworking of a very, very deep, mystical, philosophical construct of energy systems that I don't know anything about. Now, I could talk a tiny bit about that. But where we sometimes go wrong in yoga is that we package that up into something really, really neat. So, there was a text written, I think in the 70s, that assigned colors to the chakras. And then we sort of started to describe them as these spinning wheels of energy. And then through a sort of Jungian psychological overlay on that, there was work. So the book Eastern Body, Western Mind. There's nothing wrong with any of those concepts. And I'm not, I think if they serve people and they're useful for people, that's great. But the problem comes when we mindlessly blurt out language that we actually don't fully understand, and that we then wonder why people can't attach meaning to it. So when you create yoga systems where people don't feel able to question, or where some of these descriptions are sort of conceptualized as absolutes, when you're the person in the yoga class going, oh, well, wait a minute, why do I not see this color when I bring my awareness to this point in my body? We feel like we're getting it wrong. When actually, maybe it's just that you're able to discern that this doesn't feel right, because I'm not going to say it isn't true. That's not the case, but it's a construct, and it's an idea and a concept. Is that making sense? I'm maybe on a rant, but
No, it makes a lot of sense, and it makes me think of some Mark Singleton's work, and other people as well, where like obviously there's this rich corpus of information and philosophy that comes from yoga, but we also have to make sense of it in the light of it being repackaged as a product and sold. And there's just different layers to it. Really, when we talk about yoga, we can talk about the historical practice of it, and we can talk about people's perception of it and how it can get used over and over and over again, and commodified, which is probably one of those words we'll end up talking about a lot. I want to jump over, or I do want to talk about community-led practice, but actually I think we've gotten quite far in the conversation, and we actually haven't defined or talked about this idea of trauma-informed yoga or trauma-informed practice. So I was wondering if you could kind of talk about your experience of that, maybe give us an idea of maybe like a loose definition or cluster of philosophical ideas behind it, and then sort of talk about how you've applied it in your own experience with different populations.
yeah, absolutely. So trauma-informed yoga, I think, to take a step back from that, the idea of trauma-informed practice was really one that has evolved over time, but particularly around about the early 2000s was defined by the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services, I think an American organization, as being the idea of practicing in a way. I think education was the first platform where trauma-informed practice was discussed and implemented, but that has since spread to healthcare, to the prison system, to criminal justice, and has made its way now to yoga, and to many other sort of ways of working with people. And so the core principles of trauma-informed practice are most commonly defined as safety, trustworthiness, choice, collaboration, and empowerment. And that the way that in which we practice should encourage, support, and promote a sense of safety, a sense of trust, a sense of choice, a sense of an ability to collaborate, to share the way that the ideas or the decisions about you are made, and for people to feel empowered and not disempowered by their experience. And if you think about all of these systems of education, of healthcare, of criminal justice, they tend to be places where disempowerment is at their core. And I think trauma-informed practice is really about trying to change that. And much of the work that I'm led by is Judith Herman's work around trauma and recovery. And the way that she describes this is that complex post-traumatic stress disorder, and maybe it's useful to define that complex post-traumatic stress disorder, or CPTSD, is different from what we talk about as single event trauma, which is a car accident or a mugging or that one-off event. But that complex post-traumatic stress disorder or developmental trauma, repeated traumatic experiences, always interpersonal, usually in the context of people who are supposed to care for us. And Judith Herman really succinctly writes about how the core experience of that type of interpersonal trauma, so it's usually sexual, physical, or emotional abuse, or neglect, but the core experience of that is disempowerment. And so the idea around trauma-informed practice is working in a way that we can work to support people to feel a sense of agency and to feel empowered. And then I guess when we think about trauma-informed yoga, so most of my training was in a method known as TCTSY, trauma-centered, trauma-sensitive yoga, which is maybe a slightly more protocolized version of the way that I work now. So I don't practice as a TCTSY facilitator as such. Now it's a licensed program. but that's where most of my formal training has been, in that field. But the core components that we work with when we're facilitating, so first of all, the idea of facilitating a yoga space instead of teaching a yoga class, is really around encouraging choice making and agency. So people having the ability to choose in which way they move, doing that through invitational language. So you could, one option is, instead of please put, now move. You see the difference in the language. So the sort of invitational language versus coercive language. Focusing non-coercion at the center of the practice. And I think focusing the student experience at the center of the practice rather than the experience of the facilitator. So that might be, not demonstrating versions of postures that nobody else in the class can do. It might be making sure, and I would hope that most yoga teachers are not deliberately coercive in their practice, but making sure that we aren't subtly creating environments of coercion where people feel that they don't have choice, or that there is a point of achievement that they have to get to, otherwise they're failing. So the trauma-informed way really seeks to challenge all of that and to put a focus on the development of agency. And we know that agency is something that lots and lots of people haven't felt that they've had in their life. And particularly traumatized people and survivors of trauma, that core experience is one where you don't have agency in what happens to you. The other sort of core components are around mutually authentic relationships. So the relationship that is built in a boundaried way, both between the class, which more and more I'm starting to believe is more important, between participants in the group, but also between a facilitator and participant. And then the idea of present moment experience as, an opportunity to inhabit the present moment, when often the impact of traumatic experience means that we find it very difficult. When a survivor, finds it very difficult to be in the present moment, we can begin to cultivate experience of being in the present moment. And the last one is around interoceptive awareness. So the idea that instead of thinking about how a posture looks, what the shape looks like, how perfect it is, that we're really beginning to turn the gaze more internally to what does this posture feel like. Now, it's sort of ironic because if you go back to the philosophy of yoga, nobody ever said it's about what your handstand looks like. But, it's almost like we've gone full circle in creating, over the last few decades, there's been such an outward focus on the physicality of yoga. And I guess the trauma-informed approach really moves that practice back to what do you feel? What do you feel in your body? And maybe it's really important at this point to say that trauma-informed yoga is not about the traumatized people in the room over there. As a society, as a population, most of us have experienced some type of interpersonal trauma, some of us more than others. Some people who have a sort of meet a diagnostic criteria of complex post-traumatic stress disorder. This is even more important. But in creating that trauma-informed space, we're really working to create a space where people that might find a traditional yoga class intolerable might just have a window into the practice that feels a little bit safer and a little bit more like it works for them. I don't know how much of the way that goes to explaining.
No, that's really good. And one of the things that came out as you're talking about it is it's interesting because I think a lot of these newer practices and methodologies and philosophies are coming out. They're really coalescing, and they sort of interrogate a lot of the assumptions that we have about institutions. What I mean is as you're talking, a lot of my background is on student-centered teaching. And you see that you mentioned it as well, like a lot of the concepts in learner-centered teaching or student-centered teaching, they're complementary to a lot of what you were just talking about as well. And you see that they kind of, I don't know, it's sort of like we're uncovering, some truths about practice, because I think so much of the way that education, especially like classical British education worked, and the way I think a lot of, assumptions about yoga, it almost has like this, Foucault, is it Foucaultian? I don't know what the adjective
Yeah,
is in that,
power
but
dynamics. Yeah.
yeah, the power dynamics in the institution, and even separately, but what you're saying about this previous focus, or maybe this current focus on what the positions look like, that makes sense as well. If you think about how knowledge has been passed down, in the past through books, especially like old texts and things like that, trying to recreate what certain things look like. And then also now how much learning is done through YouTube and things like that, or DVDs, comparing, the visual aspect. And it really takes that sort of human connection out, because if we're going to be talking about things like interoception, how things feel, it really sort of requires that relationship with the facilitator to really think about those things instead of just trying to recreate what it looks like. And a lot of the current thought on motor learning and skill development as well really has moved away from this idea of trying to recreate this perfect form. The way people might have been taught tennis back in the 80s would be like, well, this is what the best tennis serve in the world looks like. So you're going to spend hundreds of hours trying to reproduce it, not taking any consideration, the anthropometry or the capabilities or the differences of the person who's trying to do it. So that element of self-organization and figuring out what works well for you and those kind of emergent solutions, you're seeing that pop up over and over and over again in all different kinds of practices.
Precisely, precisely. And, it doesn't, when you think about yoga, our skeletons are different, our bone structure is different, our physiology is all different. And when we try to box ourselves into making certain shapes, and again, I think yoga culture has evolved away from that a little bit, but there still is ultimately often a focus on this pinnacle pose, or we hear people saying, the full expression of the pose is this, but if you can't do it, then try something else. That's not offering a true option. That's offering a sort of coercive invitation as to what you expect. And then, sort of saying, well, if you can't do this, try this or try this. And a different way to say that might be, um, you know, to build the hierarchy. So you start from, in inverted commas, less challenging version of the postures and say, if you want to add a little bit, you could do this, or you could try, this moving in a sort of increasing complexity instead of decreasing in the way that we offer choice. And that's a really simple way to make your choice more authentic, and more meaningful when you offer it. But also, sometimes I'm challenged and people say, but your job as a facilitator is to teach people how to make the shape, for alignment purposes. But in reality, many people that I work with, if you start off with a posture, it's hard to do it on the podcast, but if you wanted somebody to do a posture that required their arm to be extended up in the air, they might start off with their fist bunched up and their fingers curled in. And that's okay, because maybe all it takes is a cue that says, how might it be if you created a little bit of space between your fingers? And what that offers up is an opportunity for somebody to make the choice. So I didn't say, hey, Kevin, you must stretch out your hand. How might it be to see how it feels to stretch your fingers out? Okay, well, I could try that. And then you start to move towards maybe more expansiveness in your body, maybe more space in your body, if that feels okay for you.
Yeah, you mentioned that language in the webinar that you did, this idea of how might it be, sort of like an invitation for people to consider different options. I found that very, very powerful and, very important. I did a course about a year ago, and the instructor, before they would give a challenge, it was sort of like an acrobatics thing. He'd say, I've got a proposition for you. I want you to play around in this space. And, as someone who's participating in the class, and I was by far like the least skilled student in the class, it was nice. Just like, I'm going to give you a little bit of space to play around with this and see how it feels and see what comes out of it. And that felt, yeah, going back to that idea of empowerment, much more empowering than me trying to recreate these movements that there's just no way I was going to do that day. So I think that language is really important.
Learning how to make choice in your body is really important, particularly if you haven't had choice in how your body is treated. Um, it can actually be really scary to make a choice, but beginning to, you could reach your arm some of the way up, or you could reach it all of the way up. It's your choice. And the more that you re-emphasize that invitational language and choice-making language, it gives people the opportunity to practice agency, is ultimately what they're doing.
I'm just thinking about, your training, because you do training, and to help facilitators with trauma informed practice. What are some aha moments people have, with maybe thinking about that way that they've taught or instructed in the past, or things that they carry on? Because, one of the things that really came out when you did the webinar is this isn't just about yoga. This is, this could be helpful if someone is in a management role or a teacher or potentially even parenting and things like that. So what are some of the aha moments that people experience? Or maybe when you talk to former students who've gone through some of your training and say, oh, this has really worked for me, or all of a sudden I've started doing this thing differently and I get much better results or I build stronger relationships.
I think so. So two main things happen. One is that people talk about the value of language shift, and how much it has helped them to facilitate a yoga space that feels that it's achieving part of what yoga is about, which is about self-awareness rising. When you change that language to you could or you might, you give people options. When you remind people, so one of the things that we see quite often is this is your yoga practice. And what that does is it quite subtly reinforces the idea that the person is there to practice for themselves, not to please the teacher. Um, and so the language shift is really meaningful, and it's something that I sometimes forget because all of our teaching team teach in this way because they're trained to do that, and also because the natural disposition of people who want to teach in outreach settings tends to be one that is um, more collaborative. But I do when I run we run a lot of training modules on yoga teacher trainings, and I'm always surprised by how much coercive language is still happening, and that some of the experiences that people are still having very regularly in yoga studios internationally with teachers exerting power and control, and whether that's in an abusive way, which is less common, or whether it's in a more subtle way that just slowly starts to disempower and create the sense that somebody else knows better than you do about what is right for your body, or right for your spiritual well-being. And those are the sort of the foundations of where we start to create environments where abuse can arise. When we I always say you should be deeply suspicious of anybody who doesn't let you ask questions, or anybody says that this is the only way. And we've seen that in yoga lineage again and again. This is the way. There's always another way, and there's always different ways. And so for me, that's a red flag. Um, so so that I think is really key. But then also the idea that as yoga teachers and as people facilitating yoga spaces, we can move towards not centering ourselves as the key point of focus in that space. So when I'm facilitating in a trauma-informed yoga space, I'm hardly um, looking, I'm hardly making it about me being the teacher. It's about being in a space with people and giving them the opportunity to move and to breathe. So it's not about you always having all the answers. It's not about you giving the best adjustments, and adjustments and hands-on touch are something that we talk about a huge amount in these trainings. Is we don't always have to be, in fact, very little do we have to be putting our hands on somebody in order to show how good a teacher we are. And I think often in the mindset of a neuro yoga teacher is that you have to be giving 150% of yourself to be seen to be a good teacher. And some of the wisdom, I think, in being able to facilitate a yoga space that is truly empowering is about knowing when to back off from that and to let people have their own experience.
Yeah, it's one of the things that is true of coaching physical activity, exercise, CrossFit, whatever, is when you're young, you want to tell everybody everything and show everybody everything and cue and tell them all these things. And, I think as one becomes a more mature coach or facilitator, you learn to kind of hold back and give people more space, and not try to show off or do whatever. And, it's one of the things change the subject. One of the things I experienced a lot when I first started exercising, even before I became a CrossFit coach, I remember going to CrossFit classes, and you would always see those really dogmatic coaches who just say, "This is the way you have to do things. This is it," And it always turned me off. And then as I got older, I realized it's like it's because certain times people lack confidence in themselves to be ambiguous sometimes and say, well, I don't know, or let's give it a go, or let's see how it is. You see so often people hide behind their role of being a coach or a facilitator or instructor, and they sort of wrap themselves up in the dogma of whatever practice it is. And you can tell they get very, very uncomfortable if it's ever questioned. And to me, that strikes me as a sign of, perhaps immaturity or just not feeling confident enough to give people space to figure things out. Speaking of dogma, and it's one of the things I wanted to talk about. as we talk about this idea of trauma informed practice, I think there's a lot of people who over the last few years have heard the word trauma come up much, much more than they used to. And, sometimes there's this perception that perhaps the idea of trauma has been co-modified or co-opted into sort of, perhaps another way to make money, or perhaps that, there's almost like a trauma industrial complex and, various forms of products or self-help and things like that. And, I know there are people in the audience who will hear this and will start thinking about that aspect of it. I was wondering if you could just kind of talk about that perception of trauma and perhaps the commodification of trauma.
Yeah, I think it's really important, and it's something that I think about a lot because I'm part of it, right? So as soon as I sell a training called a trauma informed immersion, um, I'm commodifying trauma, and I definitely have had moments of thinking like, is this right? And I do believe at the moment that the purpose and value in what we offer and the importance of this information is important enough that it's okay to get it out there, and ultimately we have to be paid for that to work. But it's definitely a fine line, and I think what you need to be constantly doing is looking at who you're centering. How do you bring other voices into that conversation? So on the 60-hour trauma informed immersion that I run, we have multiple different speakers coming in, making sure that you're teaching in ways that feel collaborative and that feel trauma informed at their heart. And one of the things I'm thinking about just now is, when I go and offer a trauma informed module on a teacher training, I don't want that to be about ticking a box that says, right, we taught our students trauma informed practice. I really would like to see a move towards all of those trainings being delivered in a way that is trauma informed at the heart, because trauma informed is people informed. It's not a specific way of working with one group of people. We can work in trauma informed ways. It isn't always easy. And one thing that's quite interesting is in my work in the university, when I go into a busy Teams meeting, I've really been reflecting recently that actually it is very difficult to show up in a trauma informed way in that kind of environment. Um, but I guess, to go back to your point about commodification, I think we do need to be careful. I think there's a risk that talking about trauma informed practice can become dogmatic. And you see that. I have read articles that say this posture, and this posture, this asana in yoga are good for trauma in inverted commas, and this one, and this one are bad for trauma. And I would really, really strongly reject those concepts, because as soon as I do that, it's disempowering. I'm making a decision about what one person will find um, triggering or not. So I reject anything that says there is only one way, and I also reject the idea that people say you should never ever ever touch anybody if you're working in a trauma informed way. There is definitely a conversation to be had, and there are definitely issues around consent. But if we say this is the only way, then do we not just stand to re-perpetuate the same dogmatic ways of being where we don't encourage questioning? Eyes open and closed is another one. Oh, people who have experienced trauma shouldn't close their eyes. You should always tell people to keep their eyes open. Well, no, that's not true. Giving somebody the choice, you can have your eyes open or closed. I don't know whether having your eyes closed or open works for you. It's your choice. It's your body. It's your eyes. You can close them if you want. You can open them when you want. Um, and so I guess it's really difficult, because when we work, and ultimately yoga is work, and it's part of the capitalist nature of what I do, is that there has to be income streams that come from it, because we've got to pay our gas bills, right? Much as I would like for that to be different, it isn't. We exist within a capitalist society where we're all part of the hustle.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's probably what we should talk about next, actually, because
Yeah,
whenever we, think about things like, you know, c- community, trying to build something up, like you said, you gotta pay the gas bills. What are you saying about dogma is interesting, because I found the same thing. Whenever you try to do any sort of, training and turn something into a procedure or protocol or whatever, it's so easy for things to ossify into dogma, and when you're teaching it sort of doesn't really matter how much you can say, like, there's different ways to do this, different ways to do that. People often write things down into like a 3-step method and say, okay, this is the way to do it. This is the correct way to do it. And you just see it all the time. Sometimes I'll just make one-off comment in a course, and then someone internalizes that. And you see, you just kind of perpetuated the whole cycle of dogma all over again. People say, well, this is the way to do it. And it's just so hard to say, no, no, that's not what I meant. I meant consider this, and this is one way to do it. And then, you're like, yep, okay, that's the correct way.
And the truth is that that the model of protocolizing something, packaging it up, selling it, and licensing it is the way to make money. And lots of our colleagues in yoga not for profit have done that. Lots of people have advised us that we should protocolize what we do, package it up, sell it, and sell it internationally. But ultimately, for us as an organization, and let me be very clear that our financial model doesn't work. Um, but the truth is that that's never what we wanted to do. We believe that the work that we do is on the ground, it's in community, it's in relationship with other people. So for me, having 500 teachers that can tick the box of saying, now I've done that training, it's not the wrong way to go, but it just wasn't the way for us that felt like we were achieving our mission and vision. Because I also think there's a really important question that as yoga teachers are also, commodified by yoga teacher trainers of paying lots of money to do training. And then, the question is how much of that money is made back. And if you're teaching to go and teach, if you're educating people to go and teach outreach and outreach settings, then people have to be supported to be able to make that happen through either grant funding or community effort. And it's important to me that we're able to support the people that we train in how to do that, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, there's a couple threads there that I think we should kind of hone in on. There's the old adage about how do you make money in a gold rush, by selling picks and shovels, and it's something you see over and over and over again in any kind of aspect of the wellness or fitness industry. The first consumer is going to be the people who want to become the instructors and the trainers who spend the thousands and thousands of dollars on training that they might never make back. And then you do see that the organizations that tend to make the money are the ones that can package those up. And it's something that Matthew Remsky and I talked about in the podcast, where it's just like, really, if yoga teachers want to make money, they like almost have to go over to like a belt system like karate or martial arts, where you have to pay for these different levels and there's additional training. As much as you can package it up and protocolize it, that's where the money is, unfortunately. And we had this conversation off camera. We've had it a few times where you try to do something different and you try to fight the sort of systemic incentives and disincentives, and sometimes you just feel like you're banging your head against the wall because there are very specific ways to make money that are legible to the system. And obviously one of the biggest ones right now is to become an influencer, to leverage your following on Instagram or whatever, and then to sell people a product. And it's so hard because it's something we found as well. It's like, we spend all this time trying to get, hopefully teach and give communities, what we think are the important tools so people can kind of break away from that system and have their own community-led movement groups and exercise groups. Um, and that's great. But actually sometimes people just want to be told what to do, and B, probably the easiest way that we ever found to kind of capitalize on that message was when we started selling online programs, which is something that I initially, didn't really have much interest in. And obviously you can convince yourself that's beneficial, and I believe it's beneficial. But then at the same time, it is really hard. So I'd like to talk about your experience with Edinburgh Community Yoga, as much as you want to talk about it, and kind of what you learned, or what the experience you've learned of actually working in the real world in this sort of capitalist system.
Yeah, I wanted just to finish up the last bit about the trauma industrial complex, because I think there is an important point there, and it's Darren McGarvey has written most recently about this, who's a really excellent Glaswegian sort of political commentator, who also goes by the name of Loki. He's a rapper. For full disclosure, I haven't actually read the book yet, but he wrote, his original book was Poverty Safari, on the idea that middle class, well-meaning people pilot themselves into areas of socioeconomic deprivation and push middle class practices on them without any understanding of how the community operates, which definitely gave me a lot of food for thought. But the other part is that, as you mentioned earlier, as that conversation around trauma has become more and more in the main domain, there's a real risk that people's survivors of trauma's stories are being exploited and capitalized. And part of that is driven, maybe this does tie into your next point, but part of that is driven by the third sector government funding, government level funding desire for people with lived experience to contribute to the development of programming, which is important. But we've certainly learned some difficult lessons at Edinburgh Community Yoga about not platforming people's stories as a way to improve exposure, because it has backfired for us. But once those stories are out there, and Darren McGarvey talks really, really well about his own experience of this, often people who are survivors of trauma are happy to share about their story in the moment. But once that's out there, it's out there forever. And we don't know what the trajectory of that will be down the line. And, there's a big responsibility in the ways that we engage with each other, in the ways that we share our stories, and most importantly, the stories of other people. And I've been looking online recently at an exercise program focused on young people, young overweight kids, and it's hugely popular. They've got hundreds of thousands of followers on Instagram. And what's working for them is that they've got, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10-year-olds talking on camera about their experiences of being bullied, of being overweight, of how much the programs helped them. And I see why they're doing it. And I watch it and I'm like, God, that's brilliant. What great work. But at the end of the day, those are young kids whose stories of trauma, of adoption, of bullying are being exploited for a well-meaning, well-intentioned benefit, an organization. But there's a question there to be asked about the way that we, turn people's trauma into that sort of capitalized construct, even when it's with good vision and mission.
You see how people can get pulled in that direction. One of the things that we found is just that, testimonials are big, even if it's not, based on people's experience of trauma. And it's one of those things that I never feel entirely comfortable with, even if, we get people's consent. Or I think of the classic one that you used to see, and hopefully we're seeing less in personal training situations, the before and after photos. And I just think, you see it all the time in boot camps, and that's not overtly trauma, but just using your position of power to convince someone that it's okay if you take, quite revealing pictures of people, often shirtless or in a sports bra or something like that, before and after, for people to look at. I think that's something that most people would not be comfortable with. But then, just because you have even if you're saying, well, I'm helping people, it is really iffy.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point. And I guess, to be really clear, I don't have the answers to any of these things. These are more just the conversations that I sort of mull over, and we're always navigating ways to do the right thing. So Edinburgh Community Yoga, I think you were talking about how you can sort of stay true to your grassroots models, but balancing that with the sort of influencer culture, the model of the internet. I think it's really challenging as an organization. So we have just announced our closure in July of next year, which I am sort of processing at the moment. And we've made that decision with a view to being very committed to, I guess, living the practice of yoga, and making that decision in a way that is considered, that is calm, and that is planned, instead of trying to hang on to something that potentially isn't working. The real heartbreak in all of this, and the thing that is causing me the most distress, is that we are not closing because there's no demand for our work. So we run a huge program of social prescribing in and around Edinburgh and Fife, working with a model of social prescription where people are referred into our trauma-informed yoga programming. It's free at the point of service. We're working in some of the most deprived areas of Edinburgh and Fife. All of our classes are waitlisted. But the reality is that post-COVID, our income generating streams have collapsed. So our public class program, we lost our premises in Edinburgh because that business went bust. It was a cafe with a yoga studio attached. They liquidated. We then didn't have a venue. Our public class program then was disbanded because we weren't generating any income from public classes. Lots of our income generating work we've lost. So many of our programs were in partnership with prisons, the third sector, the NHS, because of the squeeze on all of the finance financial systems of those organizations, what's the first thing you get rid of? It's the yoga program for people in a psychiatric hospital. So lots of those income generating streams were lost. And so really that left us with the work that we do in teacher training, which, as I've already said, we're not going to charge thousands of pounds for that. We try to keep our prices as moderate as they can be. And we always offer 3 50% scholarship positions to marginalised groups on every single one of our trainings. So over the last couple of years, we've made, cuts, we've tightened the belt wherever we can. And it's important to say that our running costs are low. Our core costs to run the organisation are less than £50,000 a year. But the reality is that the picture of grant funding means that, we cannot raise those costs anymore. And I think, grant priorities are going elsewhere. And I've been ruminating quite a lot lately of, maybe we got it wrong. Maybe we needed to go to philanthropists and, beg the rich people for more money. A few people have said that to me. Well, you're just not moving in the right circles. You need to go and engage with the people who have the money. But to be truthful, I don't even know how to do that. I'm not in those circles, and I don't have a great desire to spend my time trying to talk people into giving me money. So there's that. Then there's do we need to get, should we have got better at selling stuff on Instagram? Should we have an online platform? Should we, as one of my colleagues texted me last night and said, maybe we need to take pictures of ourselves in leotards and put them on Instagram. I was like, I think there's probably a niche for that. But we, that's not the way we work. It's not what we do. It isn't where our hearts are in terms, the work that we do is on the ground. And I think we're coming to the conclusion that if we can't make the work that we feel that we were put on the earth to do, if we can't make that work in a way that feels aligned to our values, then sadly, so be it. And again, I'm sure that could be argued with, and somebody would say, well, don't be silly, you should have done X, Y, and Z, but we are where we are. And I'm really trying to view that with a sense of feeling proud of what we've achieved. We started off our organisation 11 years ago with a vision of having, one outreach class in an addiction recovery cafe. And that's where our work began. And, then at our peak, we're running sort of 30 outreach programs in and around the community with a team of 20 teachers. And so what we've achieved is extraordinary, but letting that go is hard, but maybe the right thing to do. I don't know. I'm still in that process of figuring that out.
Yeah, I mean, it's so hard. Like I've said, Jill and I have tried to be really flexible in what we do, and Jill has the kind of capacity to go online and do the Instagram thing, and she does it very well, and she's done it in a way that's like true to what we try to espouse, not falling into the trap of, leotards or this one weird thing or, whatever. And, we get like, loads of messages on a monthly basis saying, thank you for just wearing normal clothes. Thank you for trying to not make things weird. So maybe Jill's been able to find that niche, but man, it's just so hard. And it's one of the things I want to talk to you about today. It's like, how do we make good things happen if we don't want to get caught in the grant cycle and like, constantly, writing applications. And like you said, if you go and you find one rich philanthropist, then I just feel like, again, we're just recreating the cycle. Like, do we have to go to rich individuals with hat in hand saying, hey, you, whenever you made this video game 20 years ago, now you're a billionaire. Could we please get X amount of money so that we can continue to run a program? And, I don't know what the answers are. And I don't know, like I'm looking at the future and I don't know what new opportunities are going to open up as well, because really, I think, post COVID, it's sort of accelerated a lot of trends that have been happening anyway.
I guess what I do believe is that there's middle ground. And again, I've been reading a bit of the connected community ideas, and more and more I'm sort of a belief that we have to be part of our own communities. So I now live in Fife. I'm not in Edinburgh. And so, rather than look at what communities can we pilot into and run programming, I'm sort of starting to evolve to think about what's happening in my own community, what's happening here, what can we do together. But also, are there ways that rather than going to one philanthropic person, are there ways that we can engage local businesses? So, for example, Martin of Pitmilly, a hospitality business in Fife, and also where I live. But, they've been really kind as a business to fund our yoga program in Methil for the last 6 months. And so, that's a donation that is made to Edinburgh Community Yoga that lets us continue that work. And I sort of started to think, there are other businesses locally that would surely be committed to saying, I'm not going to pay to keep your organization going as a centrally run organization with lots of core costs, but I am happy to pay, X amount of money to keep a local yoga program going. Where we start to get into complexity is how that works when you operate without the construct of a not-for-profit business that can take donations. And that's the bit that I'm still trying to figure out. We've got locally here in Fife, we've got a great community of yoga teachers that are invested in teaching in the community, invested in learning about trauma-informed practice, but we just don't quite have the structures that allow that to happen very easily. And so, yeah, I guess I don't have the answer, but I'm in the process of thinking about what are the different ways that we can continue to keep good community-based work happening in ways that don't depend on grants, because the current grant system is unsustainable. Um, and as as the cost of living increases, as more and more people are pushed into living in poverty, then those grants go to help people in crisis, to put food on tables, to help, early life intervention, and rightly so.
Yeah, and it's kind of the model that we settled on as well, is just trying to focus on small local communities and, trying to give people the tools so that they can create communities where they are. And I think you're right. I think we need to focus on localism, getting away from this down idea of swooping in and performing an intervention on a community and really seeing what is it that the community can support, and how can we sort of create this more, I don't know, rhizomatic structure of really trying to get people in the community to make these things work. And that's tough as well, because it's an extra burden on people who are already, maybe working multiple jobs or trying to make ends meet.
Absolutely. And you need a level of agency and empowerment to be able to mobilize
Hmm.
that kind of community action. But what I will say is, our class in Methil, I have a chair yoga class on social prescription. And the group there are now so invested in their yoga practice that they are talking about setting up a community constituted group that would then let them apply for funding. And almost that's the ideal, is that the demand for the work comes from within communities who look for ways to raise capital and then find people within their own communities who can offer those practices. And that's exciting to me. But the other thing is that, I mentioned the trauma industrial complex earlier, and one of the things that I was at a talk by Darren McGarvey recently, and one of the things that he said is the root ways to solve the current crisis that our communities live in terms of marginalisation and poverty is for all of us to just take small local action. And that's not about getting famous. It's not about running the biggest organisation. It's not about having the best organisation. And, I've definitely been caught in that trap. It's actually about the quiet, silent things we do. It's opening the door at the food bank. It's dropping a bag of shopping off at a food bank. It's, stopping to help somebody in the street. And that those small local actions, like, that's community development. And of course, it's more complex than that, but it did make me reflect on how easy it is when you run an organization for then the purpose to be about keeping that organization afloat.
Yes. Yes.
And that's what happens as organizations grow. You have to employ more people, you need more money to bring in more funds. And I think the third sector is a victim of that in many ways. So the question is, how do we keep things as grassroots and local as possible while having the right safeguarding and organizational policies and procedures in place that make us fit to run and fit for purpose and accountable.
I think that is probably a pretty good place to end it. Yeah, I'm in total agreement with you, and I think applying the Cormac Russell model and just really focusing on meaningful small changes that you can make at a local level, even if it's just helping out your neighbor and trying to create as many opportunities for interaction and association as possible. And we have a lot of those tools, the UK still has a vibrant like club system of local clubs, whether it's, lawn bowling or whatever, or, there's our village council, it's always packed whenever they want to talk about something. So that there are those associational structures there. And I think it's really just about how we can kind of build those up, especially if we're going to hit a period where we just can't count on the third sector anymore.
And I've just been analysing a load of data from a research project, doing a realist evaluation on our programmes on social prescribing. And the key theme that is coming out of that work is the value of relationships and community, the value of people being active in their communities. The focus is on our yoga programming, but looking at what has arisen from that in terms of community. It's people going swimming together. It's people chumming each other along to the theatre. It's people recommending the yoga class to one of their friends and then going to the GP to ask that friend can be referred in. And it's that power of community and relationship that, I firmly believe in, and I truly believe is what we'll see more of, is sort of local community action just blossoming as we go forward, I hope.
Yeah. All right. Lorraine Close, thanks so much for your time. I appreciate it.
No problem. I feel like we covered a lot.
Yeah, we did. We got a lot in.
It's a daily exercise. It's a daily exercise. It's a daily exercise.
And we're back. Huge thanks to Lorraine for coming on, talking to us. I'm just really grateful that she was willing to share so much, because it's a bit of a difficult time for them. And I'm sure that story is not unique. And I'm sure a lot of you know, sorry, I'm just squeezing under a fence. I'm sure a lot of you know of other organisations facing similar challenges, but perhaps food for thought around what we could be doing more of at community level. And yeah, anyway, thanks, Lorraine. I've linked to some more resources below that I think you'll find interesting. Also, the trauma-informed movement teaching webinar that Lorraine ran for us a few months ago. And we will be back, we'll be back next week with an end of year special with just me and Andrew, because we haven't done a joint podcast episode since we started this almost 2 years ago. So I've been invited back on into the room, and we'll just be talking about a variety of things, from strength training to impact to building stronger communities. Take a little trip through our year, that kind of thing. Anyway, I've got to get going because it's really impressively cold and I need to just move a little bit faster than I am right now. Have a lovely week, and we will be back very soon.